Can't believe we're already on the last book of Middlemarch. I thought it was never going to end. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself now. Honestly, I feel like this book has taken over my life in a good way. I'm really going to miss it. So the punchline of Middlemarch is Dorothea's remarriage to Ladislaw. And it's interesting because in a way it seems so predictable. I mean, Cadwallader says, well, Casaubon set it up that way. He made it all but irresistible. I think Brooke refers to that too. There's something singular in things, the way they come round, as if he's saying it was destined. And of course, it's for readers of the book, we see this romance simmering the whole time. So it shouldn't be so surprising, but within the reality of the novel, it's the idea of them marrying is just treated as unthinkable. As a taboo, unspeakable even. It's like beyond discussion. I think that's kind of interesting to ask why that is. It's the interesting topic in general. It's like what is not said in the novel, what is taboo. And a major thing I wouldn't have known without the annotation is that Dorothea, on page 625, in marrying Will, Dorothea risks being exiled from Middlemarch as a traitor to her class. The upshot, I think, is that Casaubon's codicil prohibiting Dorothea from marrying Will was kind of unnecessary. She would have been subject to exile anyway, apparently, but, conceivably. Anyways, what's interesting is that this went unsaid in the novel. This makes it a lot like other issues of class inequality, sexual inequality, and the violence that these entail. We talked before about the offhand way in which people bring up the fact that this or that poacher is about to be executed, and the issue of domestic violence, obliquely, metaphorically raised in some of Eliot's descriptions of Lydgate's anger at Rosie. I think a certain probability of violence that working people, women, are subjected to, that goes unsaid, that's just part of the background, but that Eliot is making us aware of this contextual reality. It's just a kind of probability of violence. And elements of the historical context come out in this moment when Brooke breaks the news. So he's walking, looking dejectedly, and the Cadwalladers come upon him. Don't take the throwing out of the bill so much to heart, Brooke. You've got all the riffraff on your side. So he's just mistaken Brooke's dejection about the marriage for dejection about the bill. So that's interesting. And James builds on that same theme here. What's the matter? Not another gamekeeper shot, I hope. He's complaining about poachers again. So historical contextual correlates to the main event of our novel, the sort of slave-like conditions in which the tenant farmers work, poverty and hunger, and the politics of reform. And the irony is that Brooke is, in these cases, he's feeling like Dorothea marrying Will Ladislaw's much worse fate. I wish it were just a gamekeeper getting shot, or I wish it was just a reform bill failing. But oh my God, it's Dorothea marrying Will. And James says another funny thing after he learns what happened. It would have been better if I'd called him out and shot him a year ago. So that's another sort of background thing. Like, what? He could have just shot him. And I think he's not being entirely facetious. He could have, called him out to a duel and shot him. So, and Celia's reaction is hilarious. Really, James, that would have been very disagreeable. alongside the fact that, Dorothea Kid is at risk of being exiled from Middlemarch as a traitor to her class. These all combine to indicate these contextual pressures and potential violence in the background of the story that we're reading, barely suppressed and sort of seeping to the surface. Or another really interesting contextual factor is James's interest in inheriting the estate. I guess it is not that surprising, but Brooke calls him out here a little bit, sort of inadvertently, and this shames James. When Mr. Brooke says, well, I always could take Dorothea out of the will, and so the land would go directly to Celia and you. And that humbles James. He's like, oh shit. James is forced to face a motive that he'd been disguising to himself. If Dorothea were not to marry again, or if she were to maintain Lowick, then James's heir stood to inherit this common estate. So anyways, he is a blithe, oblivious beneficiary of the kind of economics of marriage. The function of marriage is a means of, brokering property. That just becomes very naked when Brooke brings up the possibility of changing the will. This exposes, I'm just treating her like furniture. Middlemarch is a historical novel, which is to say that Eliot is trying to represent the action of history on personal lives. We usually just want to focus on the personal lives and think about, history as the background context, more of the scene than the action. But I also mentioned how since the democratic revolutions in the US and France, the active role of history in experience has become more and more acknowledged as decisive. That's to say, since these democratic revolutions, society has become aware of itself as deciding its own history, of shaping its own history. What Martin Luther King Jr. called the moral arc of the universe, bending towards justice, the sense that the comprehensive justice of society is the true measure of who we are. This is a consequence of the democratic revolutions. I mean, the world, and it's the bridge that is getting crossed in Middlemarch from a basically feudal world in which the lower classes don't count. Women, largely don't count, don't matter. And we're observing a big part of the story of Middlemarch is this background kind of seismic shift to bring to prominence and recognition of members of society that didn't used to count. In the terms we were talking about last time, of the distinction between music and noise, or signal and noise, Mr. Brooke was used to considering Dagby just background noise, ignorable. And all of a sudden it's become a signal that he has to pay attention to, that he should have paid attention to. He would have shared himself the embarrassment of his short-lived political career. And that's sort of what's happening here with James too, is getting shamed. I think this is a nice demonstration of how crucial a historical lever shame is. People can pretend for a long time not to notice other people, and the ideological illusion was preserved of aristocratic benevolence, that we're it's actually in the best interest of women and working people not to have a say in their own lives, that their benefactors know better, know what's best, so they actually do care about them. But what we see, and I think the background action that's really decisive in Middlemarch is disclosing just what I was saying about Dorothea and Ladislaw, that disclosing the fact that, for all this pretense of concern about Dorothea, that she could be exiled from Middlemarch as a traitor to her class. That's sort of a threat held, over her head. That's in a way all the more powerful because nobody mentions it. So these background realities coming to the surface and are getting shook up. And that's part of the story here. I mean, James takes a really hard line at first against Ladislaw and Dorothea's marriage, says, I'm never going to see him, but he caves eventually. And so it's a sign of a restructuring of class boundaries. So as interesting and moving as the individual stories are in Middlemarch, I think in a way the main stories are the rather impersonal historical shifts in the background conditions, configuration of class, gender relationships. This situation of living with a background vulnerability to violence, persistent probability of violence according to gender or class or race is very familiar to us now. On one level, we're all, going about our lives participating in a quote unquote normal in which we're all, equal and free to do what we like, but where in fact that assumption of normalcy is predicated on very unequal vulnerability to violence. This topic makes me think of a couple classic Vietnam era movies based on real people. Bonnie and Clyde and Dog Day Afternoon, both about bank robbers, notably queer couples, sexually non-normative couples, intensely romantic stories and portrayals in both of these movies. They were caught in military-style ambushes by the federal government. But what's really interesting about the structure of these movies is that this conclusive ambush comes out of the blue. They're very, very abrupt, violent, kind of terrifying endings to both of these movies. I don't mean to spoil anything. I totally recommend watching them. You realize, I think, the force of the movie, regardless, has to do with this realization that the life was a fantasy, that they were doomed and didn't know it. What they thought was normal reality was a fiction structured around this violence that they were subject to but didn't know it. So it reminds me of what I've been saying about Middlemarch a little bit. This idea that we've been going there, we're proceeding in a story, or we're following Dorothea's and Will's story, but then all of a sudden it turns out, he could have just been shot preemptorily. And that would have been that. That is an illuminating background detail. It didn't happen, so it's like we follow the story we follow. But it kind of makes all the difference to know that it could have happened, or that Dorothea could have been exiled as a traitor to her class. These contextual probabilities, although not realized, make all the difference, right? And that's true for us too. And it's so easy to overlook them. Idealism like Dorothea's functions to bring this kind of inequality to the surface so that we notice it. Been living during the pandemic in Boulder, Colorado, where there was a mass shooting just last week, which of course is becoming less and less extraordinary. It'd be kind of inevitable for all of us at this point to find ourselves, if not in a mass shooting, in the proximity of one. Sort of the point I'm trying to emphasize about the background subjection to violence. It's a real probability. Even if you're not a victim of it yourself, the probability is real. It's something we have a really hard time grasping intellectually, and it's such a crucial, urgent problem to grasp in so many ways, not just in terms of systemic social violence, but climate change is also a matter of probability. It's just like probabilistic catastrophe, and we're so prone to say, well, if it doesn't happen to me, it doesn't really matter. I think that's what literature is for. I think that our art is for, is communicating these realities that we have a hard time grasping otherwise. Here's a wonderful little clip after the Paris terror attack a few years ago of a father and son talking about, I think, the same thing.
Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Tu comprends pourquoi ces gens ils ont fait ça?
Oui, parce qu'ils sont très 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 méchants. Les méchants, c'est pas très gentil les méchants. Et il faut faire vraiment attention parce qu'il faut changer de maison.
Mais non, t'inquiète pas. On n'a pas besoin de changer de maison. C'est la France, notre maison.
Mais il y a des méchants, papa.
Oui, mais il y a des méchants partout. Il y a des méchants partout.
Ils ont les pistolets, ils peuvent nous tirer dessus parce qu'ils sont très très méchants, papa.
Oui. C'est pas grave, ils ont des pistolets, nous on a des fleurs.
Bah les fleurs, ça fait rien, c'est pour.
Si, regarde, tu vois, tout le monde pose des fleurs.
Oui.
C'est pour combattre les pistolets.
C'est pour protéger.
Voilà.
Et les bougies aussi.
C'est pour ne pas oublier les gens qui sont partis. Hein.
C'est pour nous protéger les fleurs et les bougies.
Oui.
That's pretty amazing. But what's really striking is how objectively correct the boy is when he says, flowers, they're nothing, candles are nothing, they have guns, and that's totally true. Civilization is a creative project where we have to decide what civilization is. It's a social experiment in self-definition. The fact that we even have the conversation attests to the fact that we're negotiating who and how, what kind of civilization we want to be. So you can't just pretend like it's obvious who the us is and who the them is, and just maximize your firepower to protect the us. And that's why flowers matter, is that it's a way of defining what we're about. There's a trade-off between security and neighborliness. It's always the case. It's the case in every conversation. Neighborliness is about reaching out, about welcoming the stranger, the unpredictability of others, and hence it's about vulnerability. Short essay by the philosopher Immanuel Kant called Perpetual Peace, or in German it's To Eternal Peace. It's an argument basically for the importance of flowers over guns. It's another way of putting it. But it's very rigorous. The point is that when we talk about foundational civilizational ideals like peace and justice and truth, they're ideals, but they're also practical realities. On some level, we live in a society. It's supposedly at peace. That's a premise of just our daily lives. We're supposedly at peace, but it's crucial to maintain a certain gap between the imperfect level of actual peace and justice and the eternal peace that we can imagine, the perfect justice that we can imagine. It's crucial to keep imagining that, because otherwise rot, corruption creeps in, right? If you just, the complacency again of assuming that, what we take for peace is all there is to peace. It just is not true. So it requires a leap of faith. It is a matter of a kind of idealism. But Kant's argument is that it's built into communication. When we talk, we assume a possibility of agreement, a possibility of truth between each other. That's a premise of communicating. And this is the basis of larger ideals of peace and justice, something like what it means to weave George Eliot's web. It's through this perpetual pursuit of ideals of justice, where we never arrive. So we just keep reapplying these ideals to ever new, unpredictable, practical realities. The crooked timber of humanity continues to grow. A particular focus of Middlemarch is the sort of transitional history of the institution of marriage. There's obviously a lot of confusion about marriage. There's so many different experiences of marriage represented in the novel. Probably the most famous thing ever said about Middlemarch is Virginia Woolf's comment that Middlemarch is one of the few English novels for grown-up people. I think it has to do with the maturity and the complexity of its representation of marriage and mature love in general. It's provocative thought that to see what Virginia Woolf saw as a uniquely mature representation of adult sexual romantic relationship that might also be compared to Bonnie and Clyde, Sonny and Leon. It might be because of this line here, of this very striking line of Dorothea's, marriage is so unlike everything else, there's something even awful in the nearness it brings. It's an acknowledgement of a certain reality of marriage, that marriage is about personal identity, becoming identified as a couple more than as an individual. There's a kind of transformative, transfiguring, sublime aspect to that. It may be newly emergent in this new democratic mass consumer society that's emerging here at the end of the Romantic period. People see marriage as expressive of who they are. That's an attitude, I think, that Dorothea, anyways, is inaugurating, or Middlemarch in general is telling the story of the historical emergence of that. Dorothea goes through typical pattern of a Jane Austen plot. The first love fails, and the second love is a response to what the mistakes revealed, so that she can embrace this awful nearness going in and embrace it deliberately in an informed way and in a grateful way. I think that's a big part of what the novel's about, really teaching us what that commitment involves. It's interesting that just like she had declined to explain her honeymoon from hell went with Casaubon, where her love for him fell apart, she declines here to tell the story of her love for Ladislaw. And I think that's important, because it's Eliot's sort of saying it can't be summed up, that it is sublime, can't be reduced to a clear explanation. You would have to feel with me, else you would never know. know, Dorothea replies, but I think that's what the novel's trying to give us, is that feeling. And that's what Eliot's indicating here. Eliot has an interesting comment about Rosamond here. She says she has it wrong. She thinks it's that she's discontented with Lydgate, but in fact, her discontent in her marriage was due to the conditions of marriage itself, to its demand for self-suppression and tolerance, and not to the nature of her husband. It's really interesting. Eliot is really depicting here the institutional conception of marriage, the creative transformation of people into a new identity. So it's not just about Rosie and Lydgate as individuals not getting along. It's about a certain failure to make this leap into new joint identity. For better or worse, Mrs. Bulstrode offers a powerful example of such subordination of the self to the union. It's really fascinating description of how she comes to learn about Bulstrode's disgraceful past and how she reacts to it. But it's before she hears what the disgrace is. It's just this moment when her brother says to her, "God help you, Harriet, you know all." And she's like, "Nope, I don't." But in that moment, she recognizes sort of the form of the reality, that it's a matter of an unspeakable disgrace. And all in an instant, she recognizes her fate. And it's an expression of marriage, of marital fidelity, that she and her husband are one institution, one unit. So this is one version of that awful nearness of marriage. I wouldn't call it a matter of virtue, and I think that's debated in the world of Middlemarch too. Many of her acquaintances are like, "You should leave him." It's a portrait of a psychology in which that option doesn't exist. And that's just pretty fascinating. It's like family. It's what Rosamond, Casaubon, both feel isolated from their marriages. Both Rosie and Lydgate fail to recognize the implications of marriage, get in over their head. And in the case of Rosie and Lydgate, they're largely impersonal, economic. It's just about the practical requirements of setting up a household. And that's what I think is one of the most interesting sort of hidden prejudices or concerns in the book that doesn't really come out till the end, but this concern about living among people who don't know who you are. Eliot also refers to it as the indifference of new faces that Bulstrode has to face as they go into exile. It's a really interesting perspective on what's challenging about the new and scary about the new democratic worlds to the aristocrat. From our perspective, or for that matter, from Eliot's perspective, looking back on the 1820s from the late Victorian perspective, in which the middle class has become ascendant and the aristocratic hierarchies are increasingly obsolete. We're used to the idea of belonging to a society of people who don't know who we are. That's normal. But to think that's intimidating to an aristocrat, the aristocrat is preserved from that with the presumption being preceded by one's identity, sort of like, I don't need to do anything. The people around me will take care of showing me who I am. I don't need to do anything to assert myself. It's pretty interesting. And I think it's revealing about class privilege in general. I imagine it's something that you see whenever a kind of social privilege is taken away. I think think we're witnessing it now in terms of the questioning of patriarchy and white supremacy, that there's this weird kind of fragility on the part of the people whose privilege is getting questioned. They've been so used to having this privilege, but actually they're super fragile and reliant on that social privilege being granted to them, and the idea of having it taken away is really threatening. So I think that's really illuminating insight into what democracy means. Living in a mass democratic society among equals, but strangers, that I see people around me that I don't know, but I respect them as my equals. That's a huge accomplishment of social trust. It's easy to forget that and just sort of take it for granted, like, oh, that's just totally normal. But what Eliot's showing us here is she's turning back the pages of history a little bit and showing us a moment when that was less normal and more of a challenge, and showing us the trailblazers. Dorothea is going through that door. Eliot's showing us what the strength it takes, the kind of character it takes to make that kind of social progress. Middlemarch began by evoking the unacknowledged Teresa's anonymous saints. And I think that's a big part of the role of Henrietta Noble in teaching. She learns from Miss Noble about her feelings for Will. Miss Noble seems a little cognitively compromised. She's explicitly compared to a dog. She has the most humble affection, if not slavish affection. That's what Dorothea learns from. That's how she learns about her own love, from this most humble model of affection. Miss Noble teaches her what love means. By the same token, it's really fascinating the role that money plays in the climactic love scene between Dorothea and Will. It's by way of talking about money that they declare their love for each other. I don't mind about poverty, I hate my wealth. In an instant, Will was close to her and had his arms around her. That's their love declaration. Isn't that interesting? And she goes on talking about it. You know, they're embracing. It's like finally they're consummating on some level this love that's just been epically, pent up for so long. But she keeps talking about money. Will was close to her and had his arms around her, but she drew her head back and held his away gently that she might go on speaking, her large tear-filled eyes looking at his very simply, while she said in a sobbing, childlike way, "We could live quite well on my own fortune. It is too much, 700 a year. I want so little, no new clothes, and I will learn what everything costs." It's kind of the most mundane and off-topic thing she could say, but in a way it's the most romantic thing she could say. That she's ready to enter into this whole new world of middle-class anonymity and mediocrity. Eliot calls this novel domestic epic. This is Dorothea's epic heroism. She's bringing the epic grandeur of her love to the anonymous circumstances of middle-class domestic existence, middle-class marriage. That's what Lydgate and Rosamund couldn't do. So Eliot says, in conclusion, we're no longer in the world of Teresa or Antigone, where heroic acts can change the world in a clear cause and effect way. Our effects are more, as Eliot puts it, incalculably diffusive. The growing good of the world is dependent on unhistoric acts. And that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So beautiful, but the use of number half owing is a kind of calculation. It's evoking the kind of anonymity of statistics. And I think that's what takes the place of classical heroism, is a kind of statistical diffusion in the web of social life. The flow, she compares it here to a river. Dorothea's finely touched spirit still had its fine issues. Though they were not widely visible, her full nature, like that of the river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. So her diffusion is like a river spending itself in channels without names. This image of Dorothea's effects on the world goes back to Darwin's tree of life, the tree of evolution. So instead of unmistakable heroic acts, we have this much more subtle transmission of an ideal, diffusing an ideal through society, the way a certain species trait might, get passed along these branches, trying to make it adaptive, advantageous, the source of new and richer branching. Remember, that's Darwin's basic idea that success in nature is measured in diversity, not power, not domination, but difference, differentiation. So, you see here the strongest stem is the one that actually results in the most variety. Another key motif for this in Middlemarch is, an infectious melody, the infectious, taste for literature that George Eliot herself is trying to spread or diffuse through society and through history. These patterns, again, are patterns of environmental interaction. It's not just about the assertion of one value or one identity over the environment or against the environment. It's about adapting to the environment. Branching, arborization, is about responding to the surroundings and finding channels where they're needed, right? It's an image of a conversation. Same thing with music. It's always a conversation with the surroundings, what the music even is. And the way in which the Brooke family was made whole again at the end of the novel, I think is a case in point of this kind of musical contagion. Mr. Brooke could not resist the pleasure of corresponding with Will and Dorothea. It's the pleasure of corresponding. And one morning, when his pen had been remarkably fluent, ran off into an invitation. During the months of this correspondence, Mr. Brooke had continuously, in his talk with James Chettam, been proposing the intention of cutting off the entail. But this morning, something exciting had happened. A letter came to Celia, which made her cry. And when James, unused to see her in tears, asked anxiously what was the matter, she burst out in a wail. Dorothea's a little boy, and you will not let me go see her. And I'm sure she wants to see me, and she will not know what to do with the baby. She will do wrong things with it. I wish you would be less unkind, James. Good heavens, Celia, said James, much wrought upon. What do you wish? I will do anything you like. and will take you to the town tomorrow if you wish it. And Celia did wish it. So this is family, it's weaving the family back together. When the entail was touched on in the usual way, James said, "My dear sir, it's not for me to dictate to you, but for my part I would let that alone." So it's nothing heroic like Antigone, but James has been reconciled to belonging together and a family with the guy he was willing to shoot, that he was adamant about ostracizing, if not shooting. Final book, The Middlemarch Proper, ends in a way that also suggests a kind of diffusion of love, of family feeling. This domestic epic reaches a kind of crescendo that's appropriately modest. She tells him that the news that he's gonna get to manage Stone Court. Notice how this fairy tale end is narrated. Fred makes Mary promise that it's true and repeat it verbatim, and she says it in a kind of obedient recitation. "It's all true, Fred, and I'm happy because of it, because I love you best." That actual happy end is turned into a line of prose that Mary repeats in a tone of obedient recitation, immediately ironizes it, turns it into a performance. And to listen to the way it ends, I just find it so beautiful. Fred returns to this, the engagement with the umbrella ring, brings up some memory. And before they can name it or act it out, explain to the reader some origin of their love, they're interrupted by Ben calling them in to have some cake. So it's like one bliss follows on top of another. The domestic bliss of living at Stone Court gives way to the romantic bliss of consummating their umbrella ring marriage, which in turn gives way to the domestic bliss of having cake with the Garths. The denouement of the story turns into music, turns into a rhythm. The inaudible squirrel's heartbeat. Here it's an orgasm of domestic bliss. The comic embarrassment of riches, like the branch of a tree or the issue of a river. The point of the music, like any music, is to test for an echo, in this case in the reader. The meaning of it is just what you do with it. The meaning of the brook is where you take it, how that family grows.